Okay, hello everyone and welcome. My name's Ian Brown and I will serve as moderator for today's webinar. Today's webinar will focus on planning for and coping with ILEC forbearance. Let me first start by announcing the format we're going to follow today. We expect about 35 to 40 minutes of content, followed by about 10 minutes of question and answer. We will be doing audio with slides, so there'll be no video. And the audience is muted. At any time during the webinar, please submit questions to the panel. Simply use the chat app in the GoToMeeting settings window, and your questions will only be seen by the panelists, and time permitting, we'll try to address them all in the question and answer section. The question and answers will follow at the very end of the webinar. Next, I will provide brief introductions to the panelists and the companies they represent. Then the panelists will be alternating slides throughout the presentation. So a brief background on the two firms providing expertise on the ILEC forbearance petition. First, Marshallon & Donahue, also known as the ComLaw Group, is a full-service law firm in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, catering to businesses in IT, cloud computing, and telecom industries. Marshallon & Donahue is experienced in all aspects of federal and state laws and regulation affecting the telecommunications, information services, software as a service, and broadcast media industries. They also have an active intellectual property practice, serving the trademark, copyright, and design patent needs of their diverse communications-focused client base. Representing Marshallon & Donahue is panelist Robert Jackson. Mr. Jackson is of counsel at Marshallon & Donahue and brings over 40 years experience across a broad spectrum of communications and technology issues. Mr. Jackson is an attorney, government regulations professional, and former technology executive with diverse experience addressing the legal and regulatory aspects of financial, technical, and marketing issues associated with telecommunications, internet, and the video distribution industry. Mr. Jackson is equally well-versed in transactional work, litigation, and compliance. Okay, and CloudAge Solutions is their second partner. They're a trusted partner in the emerging and competitive telecom space. CloudAge prides itself in providing services that help communications service providers operate more efficiently and effectively. Based on their vast experience in telecom, they provide professional services that optimize the planning, design, procurement, and management of fixed network services. Additionally, CloudAge provides managed services like managed LCR that enable medium and smaller carriers to focus on supporting customers and delivering telecom services. Finally, CloudAge has developed a software SaaS platform that provides operational management and visibility tools which help small to medium-sized carriers proactively manage their back office. And panelist Chris Lee is the founder and CEO of CloudAge Solutions. Mr. Lee has over 30 years experience within the domestic and international long-distance, cable, broadcast TV, CLEC, and cloud segments of the telecom industry. He has worked for industry leaders such as MCI, Cablevision, Teleglobe, and CBS. Chris has expertise in network planning, traffic engineering, network optimization, network cost management, fulfillment, vendor billing, software development, and cloud computing. Chris is a results-driven executive based out of Sterling, Virginia, and has also been a founding executive of several successful startup ventures over the years. Okay, all that said, let's begin with the webinar. Both presenters, Robert and Chris, will share the presentation going forward. They'll pass slides back and forth to each other and collaborate on the content. I will now pass the microphone to Mr. Robert Jackson, who will start by providing some background on the USTA forbearance petition. Robert?
Thank you, Ian. As many of you know, on May 4th of this year, U.S. Telecom, which is a trade association for the ILECs, and especially for AT&T and Verizon, filed a petition for forbearance with the FCC. This is given and docketed as WCB docket number 18141. The petition seeks forbearance from the requirements for ILECs to offer access to UNIs, unbundled network elements, and to permit competitors to resell ILEC services purchased at a discount. And they also asked for some special relief for the RBOCs from their duties to deal with their affiliates at arm's length and to follow special rules for providing access to poles, ducts, conduits, and rights-of-way. Existing requirements for access to these facilities under Section 224 of the Communications Act remain untouched by the petition. Now, I'd like to say just a couple things about Section 160, 47 U.S.C., Section 160. That was added in to the Communications Act by the 96 Act, and it directs the FCC to forbear from regulating, applying any regulation or provision of the chapter, including sections of the chapter itself, to telecommunications service or a class of carrier or services. And basically, if they find that enforcement of this regulation is not necessary to ensure that the rates, charges, practices, or classifications for the telecommunications carrier or service are just, unreasonable, and not unjustly or unreasonably discriminatory, enforcement of this regulation is not necessary for the protection of consumers, and forbearance from applying such provision or regulation is consistent with the public interest. And if they find that, they have to forbear from regulation. The courts have said it's mandatory. Now, since that time, we have what we call the Windstream Amendment, and which is reflected in an amended petition by U.S. Telecom that was filed on June 21st. As many of you know, Windstream is a U.S. Telecom member that has both ILEC and CLEC operations, and they objected to the original petition as just being too favorable to AT&T, Verizon, and the rest of the big ILECs. So they sat down and negotiated a compromise, and the changes included an implementation date of early February of 2021 from full relief from the uni obligations and pricing. They postponed the price increase for unis until that same date. There can be no more requests for new or additional unis made by a CLEC after February 4th of 21, and wholesale customers need to transition their unis to a commercially negotiated or effectively tariffed service by February 4th of 21. Now, what's going to happen to this? Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I've got a good feeling that this will be granted. It's supported by substantial data showing the loss of ILEC and RBOC market power and share in the residential and mid to small size business markets. Also, if you look at the FCC, over time, it's been reducing other regulatory obligations on ILECs as they lost market share. And that given the documentation of the market share loss and the precedent for forbearing from specific regulations, I think the odds in favor of the FCC granting the petition are overwhelming. This is especially true, I think, since they had the Windstream compromise. And also, it is possible that this may be tweaked. It's not necessarily going to be granted exactly on all the terms. Their comments might affect what happens, but it will be granted, and you have to plan for that. And I think the final factor is that the current administration and the FCC chairman favor a deregulatory free market approach to telecom regulation. So bottom line is this will be granted, with or without some modifications. Chris?
Great. Thank you, Robert. Hi, everyone. It's Chris Lee. I'm going to take you through the rest of the content today. First, we're going to start with just looking at the timeline for forbearance, if it should be granted. As Robert pointed out, the initial petition was filed on May 4th of this year with the amended, what we call the Windstream Amendment, on the 21st of June. There are comments due to the FCC on August 6th, with reply comments due on the 5th. In terms of ruling on the petition, the typical process, the FCC gets 12 months to rule on a petition, can extend for an additional 90 days, or a total of 15 months. So if they were to take exactly all the time, then that deadline in 2019 would be August 4th. We feel they'll make a ruling much sooner than that. It should be noted, if they don't rule at all, it's granted. The petition's hereby granted. At that point, when the initial proposal, from the time of grant, the price for unis would go up 15% until the time when they're withdrawn from the market. But it seems that the Windstream amendment or some variation thereof would probably be granted, so that the good part about the Windstream amendment is there is no initial price increase. It just basically has a cliff on February 4th, 2021, at which point unis are no longer available. And services need to be transitioned either to competitive service providers or to ILECs, other ILEC tariffed or commercially negotiated services. So as you can see from the timeline, it looks like there's a lot of time, but as everyone on the phone understands, if you're having to go through a large scale migration, even 2.5 years is actually not that much time. Next, I'm going to look at some of the impacts of forbearance to CLECs. And again, I want to put some context around the discussion for the next several slides in terms of what cost we're looking at, in terms of cost analysis, as well as what type of carriers we're talking about here. And in terms of the costs, we're looking at the unbundled network elements, specifically loops and dedicated transport is what we're going to focus on for this analysis. There are certainly lots of other impacts from forbearance that we potentially may cover in future webinars, but for this one, we really are looking at the connectivity to the customer, which would be the loops and potentially transport. In terms of carrier types, so these are just some types of carriers that would be impacted by this CLEC-based carrier. So those providing POTS that use voice-grade loops and dedicated transport using their own TDM or IP switching platforms, multi-line voice providers that use high capacity. It's funny to call it high capacity because obviously DS1 in today's terms are really not that much capacity anymore when everyone has 50 to 100 megs at their house. But obviously that's obviously the legacy, the terminology from the thing. But using high cap, DS1 or DS3 loops, dedicated transport and switching platforms, could be broadband service providers using XDSL, so it could be DSL providers or Ethernet or copper providers that are using high capacity loops, fiber transport, and then integrated access providers using DS1, DS3 loops, transport, and IP networks. In terms of what we've modeled, driver impacts, we did model the 15% increase just because, we just throw it out there as you'll see in the first analysis. But the chances of that being phased in, I think, are lower. That it may be the Windstream amendment, which doesn't contain that cost increase. And then the big impact is, of course, the access cost increase when unis are no longer available. All right, so the first example that I go through is really using a CLEC that uses DS1 loops and ILEC transport, so dedicated transport, in this case DS3 transport back to the CLEC POP. As you can see in the network diagram, there's loops connecting customer to the ILEC colo that the CLEC has. Then those loops, in this example, I'm going to do an example of 20 DS1 loops that are then aggregated through a 3-1 MUX, DS3 to DS1 multiplexer onto a dedicated DS3 transport back to the serving wire center that serves the CLEC POP. Looking at the cost analysis, the cost impact analysis in the box there, I'll take you through that. So again, 20 DS1 loops in terms of, under the uni scenario. So I'll point out there are 3 scenarios that I've modeled here. The first one is uni, which is today's, the unis that are in effect today. So in this particular case, I'm using an AT&T interconnection agreement for the state of Wisconsin, using the price list there. When I get to special access, I'm also using AT&T's access tariff number 2 for Wisconsin to keep it consistent. So the DS1 loops, there's 20 DS1 loops in this example, cost of $902. There's DS3 transport. So transport is both fixed and mileage based. So in this analysis, this example, we're using 10 miles of transport. So that comes to $524.23 using the uni rates. And then there's a charge for the multiplexing function, the DS3 to DS1 MUX, which is another $473.51. So to transport 20 T1s from the customer to the CLEC, and this is not inclusive of entrance facility costs at the serving wire center, but just for pure transport for those 20 T1s back to the CLEC POP. Under today's unis, that's basically $1,900. Looking at the post-forbearance cost increase, and that's the uni FB, just simply goes up by 15% each of the elements. But the real key analysis is the analysis of what happens when unis are no longer available. So the likely service that will replace these unis will be special access. That's obviously what's available today, and it's the closest proxy, absent of a commercially negotiated agreement, and I don't see why there would be a commercially negotiated agreement for these wholesale services. So if we just model the current special access rates, we see some significant cost increases and disparities, and most widely seen in the DS1 loop, or these channel termination and using special access terminology. That's gone now from the original uni cost of $902 up to $2,500. You see the transport and MUX both are more expensive under special access. The total for the same exact service, but is priced under special access, is $4,020, which is an increase of 84% above what the cost is today to do this as a uni. The second example I'm going to walk through is an example of a provider using Ethernet over copper, so using XDSL loops back to a ILEC colo that they operate, and then either using third-party or the CLEC's own fiber-based transport back to its POP. And so here the scenarios are that I've modeled is, the current cost under the current uni price for this for these unis that I've modeled, and then the future cost in both a competitive building and a non-competitive building, as I'll explain that the costs for transport in those scenarios can be different. So the way the analysis goes here, it's a margin and cost. It's a cost and margin analysis. So I'm showing the full kind of gross margin items, if you will. So the assumption is the sell price, the price of the customer for a 50 meg circuit is $550. In this example, there's 8 DSL or copper loops or copper 2-wire or 4-wire loops needed to create that 50 meg connection to be bonded together. So the total of that's $95. Then there's some cost allocation for fiber transport. Since if this was a CLEC-owned network, there isn't any vendor to pay per se, but there is depreciation and amortization that needs to be allocated. So in this example, that cost is seen as $150 per this circuit. And so that takes the unit cost to a total of $245. And then the gross margin, so subtracting the $245 from the $550 gets you the $305 or 55% gross margin. Next, we're going to look at the competitive and non-competitive building scenarios. So in the competitive, this is assuming under post-forbearance. In the competitive building, we have cost for the loop, and could be from the LEC or a competitive provider. Since it's competitive, there's multiple providers there. It's $350 as seen. So in terms of the gross margin, that goes to $200. So gross margin under uni going to competitive buildings going down 36%. In a non-competitive building, that circuit cost could be as high as $475, $500, which doesn't leave much room for margin when keeping that $550 kind of sell price constant. And so as we see here, that numerically goes down to 14%. And so big impact for unis in terms of unis going away and forbearance. And there's lots of implications that come out of this. All right, so even though the timeline that I showed before shows 2.5 years until the potential loss of unis, we really feel strongly that CLECs need to start planning for this now. And as part of that, we recommend that CLECs do the following 5 things starting now and through the remainder of 2018. The first item is really a review of your customer and vendor contract language. Looking at customer contracts, looking for language in there that, you should hopefully have language that gives you some sort of pricing flexibility in response to changes in regulatory events like forbearance. Now, due to a regulatory event, your costs change significantly to the worse. really have to have some sort of mechanism, or should have some mechanism to go back to your customer and kind of take a fresh look, and potentially, I think, and you used to seek legal counsel to the impact of this, but essentially, giving like a fresh look to kind of redo the deal, if the costs change. Another significant type of contract to look at are vendor contracts. So, if forbearance happens and you have to get off of the ILEC and you get onto a bunch of competitive providers, if you have existing lease transport in your network that was there to transport the ILEC loop, true loop circuits back to your POP, and by going to a competitive provider where that transfer is no longer needed, you've got to be able to work out of that situation, and there's potential opportunities to do that. If you have other services you're buying to replace those, if you bought it from the providers that you're purchasing the transport, there's potentially you could swap out spend for spend, that sort of things. But as networks start to migrate, you're going to have lots of pieces to this puzzle to manage. If any of these things, other piece of advice sitting next to Robert here is, if you have these scenarios, really, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of consult, some legal advisor on this to kind of figure out what the right solution is for you in that scenario. The second action, and possibly the most important, is to perform a forbearance impact assessment. This is, of course, also the most involved. I'm going to take you through this a little bit in the process here. The first thing is, building, you really need to have accurate network inventory data. And what I mean by that is, understanding what circuits have our customer circuits, what locations they connect to. Small, seemingly insignificant items like having really good address data is important. So as you go through this process, you're going to need to be able to match this address data to carrier building lists and other network lists. So having good address data is actually very important. We use, for our SaaS application, we actually use a service called Smarty Streets, which has a pretty cool API that we bounce up against to get USPS certified address data. So it helps in the matching that we do. But in terms of your inventory data, having all the right elements, but having good, clean data as well is really important. Then the next step is really identifying within the buildings that your customers are in, identifying which carriers either serve the building or are near the building is a critical next step to understand your options. When you do this search, be sure to include carriers like cable MSOs. Cable has actually a lot more buildings than the typical CLECs, the typical level 3 XO, those types of CLECs. So they're going to be a great option. And unfortunately, either cable or the former CLECs, they're also your competitors, of course, but that's been the case forever. And they're obviously the large CLECs have been pretty much acquired by most of the RBOCs. But the other way you can get information on who's in your buildings is through the use of various carrier quoting tools. If you buy circuits from certain carriers today, there's one great one actually that it's kind of cool. It's the XO's quoting tool. If you quote out of there, not only do they tell you if there's a carrier in there, if it's not them, they'll tell you who the carrier is. So they'll tell you that level 3 is in this building. It's actually quite helpful. I'm not sure it helps XO get sales because most people like us and others that would find out that level 3 is the actual provider to the building would potentially just go directly to level 3 to quote to get the circuit to get a better price. But they do provide that information, which is pretty cool. The other thing I point out, there are other network or software applications that provide this type of data. A great one that we have a partnership with is a company called Connected to Fiber. We were integrating their Network Finder API into our quoting and inventory tool. They've done all the legwork. They've done all the hard work. Instead of you compiling all those building lists and such together and looking through those, they've done that and offer a pretty cool, pretty effective tool to do that. The next step is really looking at the various vendor options. Once you find out who's in the buildings, pulling cost benchmark data, like understanding the pricing they have, so you can build that into your analysis. And then the fourth step is really looking at what I call the transition path. So each customer circuit, knowing that is that ultimately you want to model it going to a competitive provider or staying on special access, really understanding the options there. And the last step is really to synthesize all of this information together and build your cost and margin model to understand really the impacts of forbearance. That's really going to be your kind of guide to drive your decision making through this process. The third item is having CLECs adopt a building-centric go-to-market approach. If they haven't done so already, a lot have kind of done this and gotten this way of doing business. But this involves things like when you're generating lead lists, you really do it based on where you have building access, where you have really good margins, and really don't try and be service provider to the entire market. Just do where it makes sense, and where you can make money and where you have access, and kind of go deep versus broad in terms of go vertical versus horizontal, and less locations, but go deeper into the buildings. But this approach certainly it doesn't come free. It requires more of a detailed data and analytic driven process, and so that can be a change of business to some companies that have not been doing business that way. In terms of what to do in terms of operations, obviously the salespeople are going to sell where they're compensated. So that's the easiest way to go building centric, is just to have higher incentives to acquire customers in high opportunity buildings, and on the other side of it, don't incent sales. So if there's ILEC only buildings, maybe there is no commission for those. And if you create that disincentive, I'm pretty sure you won't see those sales, and you can kind of start focusing on more of the higher opportunity side. The other thing is, incrementally, on-net building penetration. So as you penetrate the same buildings with more customers, this significantly increases profitability. And so you should incent around that. Quick example is, if you lease to a building and you have one customer that you leased out a 100 meg circuit to a provider that has fiber to the building, you can do that cost effectively. You could sell a second customer there, and then you probably do the same type of model under a second 100 meg circuit. But as you do the third one, at that point, the economic crossover between 100 or 200 megs circuit, two individual 100 meg circuits, and a gig is probably crossed. And so you could upgrade that one connection to the building to a gig, and then leverage some network access equipment to support all three of those customers using either VLAN or EVC separation of the various customer traffic. When you start doing that, then you definitely develop some really, really good economics at the building level. And that's really where we really need to go with this. And I think just looking back on the whole CLEC experience from the time the Act was put in place, really the CLECs, needed to go deeper versus horizontal, but the capital markets wouldn't want that. In terms of being able to raise enough money to build a handful of markets, you need to show that you're going to address 50 markets, and that's why a lot of the earlier CLEC CLECs that were out there ended up failing. All right, so fourth action here is really looking at the sales marketing organizations, the planning about how customer transitions happen. Forbearance is going to require you to disrupt the customer. So if you have to change out, if units go away and you have to go to special access or to a competitive provider, there's going to be a new install. So, if you're going to disrupt the customer, you might as well sell them some more stuff. That's just, kind of goes without saying. But in the case where you have a TS1 or multi-DS1 customer, and now you can get a competitive service in that building where you can sell 100, 200, 500 meg a gig or 10 gig circuit. There's all sorts of other service options pop up. And it's really, this is the one time that if you're going to disrupt your customer, you definitely need to do it in a way that adds more value to your business. If you have any legacy products, really need to be upgraded. Stuff like if you have a TDM voice offering, get to a SIP hosted UC, Unified Communication type platform offering, to kind of be more current with what's in the marketplace.
Chris, this is Robert. I might add there that you need to look at whether there are any state discontinuance of service requirements or FCC discontinuance of service requirements there, because sometimes you have to get permission to pull out of, say, the TDM market. So that's another thing that you need to look at.
Excellent point, Robert. Thank you. And just to finish out the slide, hosted UC, new services like that can also open up access to new markets. If you're a smaller CLEC, just focusing on one or two markets, using over the top, essentially using the customer's existing access with hosted unified communication, of course, can open up a national marketplace and to expand your reach. But of course, when you look at this, then there's a whole different way of selling and marketing your services that you have to evolve to as well if you're not doing that already. All righty, now the fifth action that we recommend you take now is really ensuring that you have the necessary platforms to manage network transitions. And by platforms, I'm referring to network inventory systems, order management systems, and invoice management systems. And from the network inventory side, as we talked about before, you need to have clean, good data. You need to have data where you can query it and identify all the components that need to be migrated, and have that relevant information that you're going to need to fill out the orders and manage the process. On the order management system side, you really need this to be able to track and coordinate. You're going to have installs and disconnects. You're going to have projects. You're going to have things that have to be done in certain sequence, and you don't want disconnects to take too long or worse, never get done. That's clearly happens a lot when there's no systems involved. Circuits stay around forever. We've done circuit reconciliation projects numerous times and always find stuff that the customer had left 5-6 years ago and still paying all that money. So having systems there to manage that and make that more efficient. And then the last piece is on the invoice management and more specifically invoice validation side, because you all know that ILEC doesn't bill correctly even under steady state sometimes, but as you have all this churn in the network, we have installs going in, disconnects coming out, they're going to bill you a lot longer than they should. They're going to bill you incorrectly for installs if you're installing to them. There's a whole gamut of things that you're going to be overcharged that will even make this migration more expensive than it really needs to be. So really another piece, if you don't have these types of platforms in an automated variety, we recommend that you do so.
Chris, another thing that CLEC should consider is taking a look at whether they need to change the tariffs, if you're getting rid of a service there or adding some services, or whether you'll be doing these things under price lists or just contract. And then your universal service payments, taxes, and regulatory fees might change. So you probably need to sit down with somebody who understands those and make sure that you're not paying neither too much, but just as importantly, not enough. If you're missing some fees, you could get in trouble with USAC or with a state PUC. So if you change the nature of your business, you need to look at your regulatory issues too.
Excellent points, Robert. Thank you.
Just a reminder, there's only a couple more slides, and we'll be wrapping up the content section. Go ahead and through the GoToWebinar control panel, submit any questions you might have for either Robert or Chris.
Thanks, Ian. All right. We're almost, as Ian mentioned, we're almost done here, down the home stretch here. Until now, I haven't really addressed the differences between using leased access and CLEC-owned, fiber-based access. And I want to do this through way of a couple of evaluation examples of what's possible. Obviously, when you serve customers using leased network, you're not necessarily in control of your own destiny. So there's certain issues like this forbearance potential issue that can come up and really be disruptive to the business, not only from a management and just a circuit standpoint. It's more from a cost standpoint. And so what I've done was I took a couple selected companies out there and put some financial metrics on this, and I kind of want to walk through this a little bit here. First, before I go through each individual example, I wanted to just describe the metrics I have here. So I have market capitalization, so it's equity market capitalization, the value of the equity of each company. Annualized revenue, this revenue is derived from first quarter annualized a revenue multiple, which is really the relative valuation of the firm. So how much is their equity worth in relation to their revenue? And then the last one is, it's basically property, plant, and equipment, so more fixed assets as a percent of total assets. And so this really tells how much infrastructure a company has. And so you may have heard the term out there called asset-light carriers. GTT used to be known as an asset-light carrier, and it seemed to be the rage the last couple of years on Wall Street. They really like this asset-light model. But what I've done is I've selected a grouping of these. And so two of these, the first two on the left, are really asset-heavy. We look at both of them, 58% of their total assets are made up of their network cost, property, plant, and equipment. But this is really a tale of two companies here, of course. We see Zayo have a pretty high valuation, probably seen as one of the crown jewels in the telecom industry today, have great fiber assets, great network assets, and earn that valuation. It's actually the highest valuation on the screen here. But we see that another vendor carrier like Frontier has really the opposite, and it's probably headed to bankruptcy relatively quickly, I would think. But see, even though they have $8.8 billion of revenue, the market cap's not even $500 million. And really, to contrast these two is it's not that you have assets; it's which assets you have. So Zayo has fiber, very good assets capable of generating a lot of revenue and cash flow. Frontier, a lot of these assets are the old copper, the copper they acquired from the various Verizon or AT&T transactions, and obviously doesn't generate the type of returns that something like a Zayo asset would generate. Moving to the right, looking at GTT. So these numbers for GTT didn't include the recent Interroute acquisition. But if you look at GTT, it's 28% of fixed assets. They do have some assets, but in the U.S., they're pretty much asset light. They're doing a lot of leasing and that sort of stuff. They have some fiber, but don't have a ton. But they still can generate a pretty good return. The outlier on the right, on the asset light side, is really an interesting story, and I think it really speaks to the cloud, communications business. Looking at Vonage, 5%. So that's an extremely asset light carrier. 5% assets as a percent of total assets, but have pretty high valuation and multiple, and really have done so with, if you look at, how Vonage has grown the last 3 years, it's really the acquisitions they made on the business side. So Vonage Business now has more revenue than Vonage Consumer, which, obviously Vonage started as an all consumer-focused company. But they did so by acquiring the likes of iCore, Vocalocity, and a couple other companies out west. Names are escaping me at the moment. But all of those companies didn't have any fiber. They buy leasing. So I guess the point I'm trying to make with this is assets can help if you have the right assets, but you still can make, generate pretty high valuation if you do the right things in terms of how you run your business and get to the right products that are that can afford you the ability to drive cash flows. All right, almost home here, almost done. I'm going to just quickly summarize our message that we've been pushing out here today, and then we'll go flip it back to Ian. First of all, we think it's likely the FCC grants ILEC forbearance in some form. Another advice: ILEC or CLEC should be monitoring this proceeding so you're not caught flat-footed. The impacts that I've shown on the cost side to losing unis are huge. So, some dramatic change in network migration is going to be needed. We recommend start planning for forbearance now. You certainly can, fight the fight in terms of the comments and all that process, but I would definitely invest some time into figuring out, okay, if it does happen, what am I going to be doing? What do I need to be doing? If you have a lot of unis, again, we recommend automation if you don't have automation in the back office systems that I spoke about. But with effective planning, analysis, and a good strategy, CLECs can survive forbearance and actually thrive and continue to grow your business. It's not the end of the world, but it's something that you have to definitely take seriously and address. That's the end of my slides. Thanks for your attention and time today. I'm going to turn it back over to Ian.
Okay, thank you, Chris and Robert. We are going to now address some of the questions that came in, and just give me about 30 seconds to get situated. I'm pleased to say that we haven't had anyone drop out of the webinar, so the material seems to be important and informational, and that's good to know. So if you give me 1 second, I'll access the panel. And if you have questions or think of any now for either Robert or Chris, feel free to send them in.
All right, so all right, so I'm going to just read off a couple of the questions, and we'll kind of take a shot at answering some of these. The first one is, how long should this process take? The 5 things CLECs should be doing now. What is the timeline a company should be looking at to complete this? And I'll start off by trying to address that one. It really depends. I mean, I guess it really depends on the scope of the network. But I think it's, in terms of getting a good assessment done, in terms of, not doing all, taking some shortcuts, I think the investment has got to be about a 3 to 5 month time frame, kind of doing the 5 things that I've noted. In terms of like marketing and the go-to-market structures, those are more just planning for now. I think the most important thing is really the discovery of the network and the assessment of the financial impact, and that can be done inside of 3 month time frame. All right, I'm looking for other. Oh, and then the follow-up was, and can this be outsourced? That's a good question. Sure, we can talk to you about that. So that's one of the things we do. Absolutely. All right, here's one for Robert. When would be a good time for a company to contact a legal advisor on these issues?
Obviously sooner rather than later, depending on, the type of contracts. I'm assuming you're talking about business type things now. Would be, if you've got form contracts, if you've got a variety of them, if you've got some long-term contracts, I think the sooner you can get better at it is better. You're going to want to, some of these things you have to negotiate with your customers, and that takes some time. Customers don't like to be surprised any more than you do, so I would sit down with my legal advisor fairly soon and just say, look, this is a project we wanted to scope out, and let's see what we're going to do and how we can do it in a cost-efficient manner. Great.
Awesome. Good. All right. So, sorry, I should have had my next one ready. Here's a question. So, was it the opinion that the Windstream proposal will be adopted by FCC for all CLECs?
Well, I think that, what policy making in Washington is, as they say, is like legislation. It's sausage making, and we won't be sure exactly what happens till it happens. Whether they adjust dates or things, a group of CLECs may come in and make a compelling case that they need an extra 6 months for one of these things or another year for that. But by and large, it's at the core of it will happen. Things can be affected at the margins, just like Winstein proved. They have changes at the margin. They didn't change the basic proposal. And, that's what I would say to us. If CLECs have a specific issue, in their state or what have you, they may want to band together and contact the FCC, not about trying to derail this because you're wasting your money, but to sit down with people with similar interests and see if you can't broker a compromise or come up with a solution that they can accept, because AT&T and Verizon want this. They want it badly, and they're probably willing to pay something for it if it's pretty small in nature. So that's why CLECs need to pay attention to what's going on this. If they've got a state association, they should be talking with their state association. If they're in a national association, they should be talking to those folks and making sure that they're involved.
Excellent. All right, so let me go down the list here. There are lots more questions are streaming in. So what is the suggested go-to in rural areas when unis are no longer available? So suggested service replacement for unis in rural. So I'll start that, and maybe you want to chime in afterwards. And it's not only rural, but rural is going to be impacted much harder than metro. So we physically are in Northern Virginia, which is probably one of the most fiber-rich and fiber-dense, markets in the U.S. So we take it for granted, that buildings don't have 2 or 3 fiber providers in each building. So in the rural, it's clearly not the same amount of facilities. Fixed wireless, maybe. I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Or if you happen to have a building that has a competitive provider in there. It's going to be a challenge. I think, it's going to, rural areas will be hit, much harder than the non-rural where there isn't as much, competitive alternative.
Yeah, I think that the wireless is a solution. I know that if you can go, like, for example, Sprint Clearwire has a boatload of educational broadband spectrum around the 2.4 gigahertz band. If that's workable, you probably get a lease. There's, power companies lots of times have fiber for into their communities. But maybe you can get some broadband money from your state to partner with the town or the county or the school district and build some fiber. You've got to be very creative and think expansively, not narrowly.
Yep. And a follow-up to that isn't there a legal obligation to keep these copper lines in rural areas where no other facilities exist?
Well, I think that's one of the legal questions that the FCC will decide, and I would imagine that one will go to court, as people will say that they really are still the provider of last resort, and there's nothing else. So I think that one will be decided probably by a court of appeals, and that of course, that may extend it. You may get the court to say, well, until this is finally decided, we'll stay the proceeding, and you can continue to buy unis, maybe at some price increase. But I'm speculating now.
Yeah, you're the lucky guy because most of these questions are regulatory focused, but. Anything we can take advantage of as an offensive plan seems most discussed about reacting defensively. So more, I think the question is getting at what can we do offensively in terms of maybe trying to derail the proceeding or.
Well, as I said, I don't think you can derail this thing. I think you can affect it around the edges. I think that, banding together with other similarly situated CLECs, whether on a national, state, regional basis, and getting in there to the FCC, coming up with some things that are reasonable, asking for, another 2 years in rural markets might be something you could do. Whether you would get it or not, I don't know, but until you ask, you need to do that. But make your asks reasonable and well fitted to your situation. I think a key thing to do is show public interest, so that if you can show that the largest employer in the county is dependent on your services in unis, and you need more time, or you provide service to the school district and to outlying students that and can't get in, but build the public interest into this thing and ask for some things. But you need to be active 6 months ago. You got to start today.
Excellent. Let's see here. All right, got a couple questions related to this same topic. Does this only affect facilities-based carriers or switchless resellers? So switchless reseller is probably a resale. So resale is part of this, part of the uni.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, the goal would be of AT&T and Verizon would be to get rid of any discounts they have, whether they would continue allowing resale at some, commercially negotiated rate. You need to sit down with them and ask them. That's another thing you could do on a proactive basis, is sit down with them and say, look, let's get a commercial agreement here that goes beyond the time limit, the February of 2021, and let's agree to something through 2025 or whatever, on whatever terms you can get. So, sitting down and negotiating with your supplier, they may well do it. A lot of times they will want to be able to show the state PUC there's still competition there, so they may give you something semi-reasonable as a price, but you got to talk to them. Excellent.
That's good. There were, again, 3 or 4 questions on that subject. Have 2 more here.
Okay.
We'll finish them out. Appreciate the questions as well. Next one. Should we anticipate ILEC tariffs being impacted by forbearance where certain tariffed services are no longer available?
Not sure what that question's getting at. Could you give me that again?
Yeah. Should we anticipate ILEC tariffs being such as special access transport? There's some
okay.
There, so.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to, I think that by and large, they just as soon get rid of tariffs and do things on a commercially negotiated basis, maybe with some, basic terms and conditions available to anyone that you can opt into. But I think by and large, the ILECs want rid of tariffs.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so the last one, can you address the use of unis as an emergency failover, cases such as hospitals, emergency responders? I think maybe the question is around unis will have to stay in place for certain scenarios where they're emergency, first responder or other, emergency scenarios. I don't think there's any carve out for that, right?
I didn't see one, but I mean, that might be the kind of thing that you work together to get a coalition that you talk to the state police, the, Homeland Security Department for your state, rural hospital associations, the sheriff's associations, et cetera, and come up with a proposal and put it out there to the FCC. The only way you're going to get a carve out is to ask and to have allies like that. You're probably not going to get it forever, but, you might get an extension for those situations.
Right. And I think, from the ILEC perspective, they really don't want to operate these copper networks for too much longer. That's kind of the end game. They've moved on. The bigger RBOCs have moved on to wireless and video.
Yep.
So I think looking at Frontier, the financial analysis on the Frontier side, that you could argue that could be the poster child from the ILEC forbearance from their perspective. We can't afford to manage these networks.
I suppose you could come up with a proposal like you did for building inside wiring that, at some point, if it's all depreciated, it's deemed abandoned and
sell it.
And sell it or somebody's willing to take it over, or you form a nonprofit to take it over or something.
Yeah.
It's a lot of creativity. It needs to be out there, but the time to be creative is now, and to talk to other people and develop allies.
Yep, absolutely. There was one last question. It wasn't really a question really on the content, but I was asked about downloading the presentation. So we will send that out, right?
Actually, perfect transition. Perfectly timed question. So, in wrapping up, first, I want to thank you for your time. Hopefully this was valuable to you. in your business. We intend to reach out within the next few business days, and we'll share a link to the webinar for you, coworkers, whoever you think might benefit from it. Additionally, in the original mailers, we announced that there was all registered webinar attendees were going to receive a free subscription to GPX Cloud. GPX Cloud is a fully integrated back office lifecycle management platform that's been developed exclusively for emerging carriers. And so we'll put that in the email. And if anyone has any questions in the meantime, please email them to the email on the screen. And that said, we'll close down now. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your week.